What I want to talk about today is you're going to hear a lot of things at Puppet Camp, especially at Puppet Conf, about how to sort of DevOpsify your organization, cool technical things that people have done with Puppet. I'm a professional service engineer for Puppet Labs, which means I do a lot of training. And my interest is more about taking the person who is just getting started with Puppet and creating an expert, as on the slide there. How many people relate to this story? New to an organization, the organization has a Puppet code base that's maybe been going for a year or two, and there's one or two people in your ops organization that are like real experts, and everybody else is kind of struggling with their fractional time. Maybe they only get to spend a couple of hours a day and a couple hours a week in Puppet, or like 1 day a week in Puppet. You're trying to get familiar with the code base and get stuff done with it. Anybody relate to that? Okay, so you're the folks that I'm hoping to give a little bit more information to. We can kind of get you up there and take some load off of the Puppet ninjas in your environment. So, let me go full screen here. So why am I here? Not in the existential sense, but I want to talk about some of the things that I considered coming into this presentation and why I ended up where I did. Managing Windows with Puppet, that was the first thing that was presented as something that we'd like to present here. It's a pain point for me. I'm a Unix bigot, so I really would prefer to make the Windows boxes sort of just disappear into the Puppet cloud and not have to worry about it. Another one that I considered was, how many people here are familiar with mCollective? The orchestration engine? Spooky action at a distance with mCollective. So if you're not familiar with mCollective, you can go out into the network and do ad hoc, one-off sort of orchestration. Pull a application server out of a load balancer and then run Puppet to reconfigure it. Really clever, interesting stuff like that. Also, this was the one that I really had hoped to dive into. Awesome sauce with Puppet and Docker. I wanted to see what you could do with Docker that's a little bit different when integrating with Puppet than you could do with something like Vagrant right now. So that's a call ahead. We're going to talk a little. This could almost be a Vagrant presentation. Oh boy, let me change the font. Okay, so all of those things are the things that I really kind of wanted to present on, but I'm a professional service engineer and a trainer, and so I actually end up spending a lot more time paired with customers who are trying to bring their new Puppet users up to speed and doing trainings, and I didn't have really time to go off into the corner and play with the cool tools. And I think probably there are people in your organization that are the same way. So I'm going to take sort of an overview of what we would teach in the classes, and then sort of the supplemental materials that I provide to the students for homework after the class, and we're going to kind of step through those. So this kind of information is really easy to find for Puppet. What is it? Give me some basic examples how to use it. There's tons of information out there, especially like on the Puppet Labs YouTube channel about clever things people have done with Puppet. And like I said, DevOpsifying your organization. This stuff is a little more difficult. Beyond this basics, how do I make that transition? There's that big gap in the middle from Puppet newbie to Puppet expert. And although there are tons of resources, like what's a logical progression through those resources? So first thing I'm going to do, well actually the framework that I'm kind of operating under is, I actually just got home from a trip and this book was sitting on my coffee table and kind of triggered this thought. I don't know if you guys are familiar with Tim Ferriss is a Bay Area resident. He has this book, The 4-Hour Chef, which ostensibly is about learning to cook. But once you scratch at it just a little bit, you see that it's not at all about how to cook, how to learn to cook. It's about how to learn to learn. So he has a kind of a framework that's embedded in that book. And there are several sort of stages that he advocates going through. And I'm just going to pick out 3 of them. So deconstruction, minimum learnable units. These are the extra resources that I'm going to be sort of presenting to you. Some of you who've been doing Puppet for a while might be familiar with some of them. Selection and sequencing. Okay, so of the blocks that we have, which are the ones that are really important to get you moving quickly? And then ordering. It doesn't make sense for you to go off and read how to write types and providers until you're familiar with resource ordering in the DSL. We start there and work our way up. Like I said, shamelessly stolen from Wikipedia and from the actual book itself. There's a picture of the index page that actually shows like a little bit more information about the model that he sort of advocates. So first off, let's start with the available resources, and then we'll go on to the selection and sequencing. Did I misspell sequencing? No. And by the way, don't worry about like writing down URLs and taking copious notes. I'll link all this stuff from Twitter later today, so you can go down and download it if any of it's interesting to you. Okay, so getting started. The usual suspects. When Puppet Enterprise is based on Puppet Open Source. Puppet Open Source has the usual sort of interaction channels that you would expect from an open source project. Puppet users mailing list, which I've linked there, and the IRC channel. I generally tend to not point new users there. As I says on the slide, Puppet users mailing list is just a fire hose of emails and information, and some of it's advanced and some of it's somewhere in the middle, and it's kind of hard as a new user to sift through what's important and what's not. I actually prefer to point new users first to this resource. Now I saw a slide on this earlier in between the presentations. I want to show you guys this. Let's make sure, see if I have internet access. If I do, I want to show you what this thing looks like. So this is the learning management system, and if you go to /learn at the Puppet Labs website, you'll see something like this. I've already created an account, so I have another tab here where I can actually go in, and there's a series of courses. 8, 10, 12 courses. Starts out simple, gets more complicated. I think it eventually ends up at, at PuppetDB. There's a little bit more content that's been added since I looked at this last. But what's really cool about this is you can go into one of these sections, maybe if you have internet. We'll see. But if you go into this section on relationships, you'll see that there's a video there of about, usually they're about 8 to 10 minutes, where one of our Puppet Labs education people will talk about the concept of relationships in the Puppet DSL. And then what's really cool, understanding that you may just be getting started with Puppet, you can actually go, on a lot of these labs, you can go to this launch button, it'll fire up an AWS instance, and you can then SSH into the AWS instance and play with the concepts that are demonstrated in that lab. So honestly, I go into professional services gigs a lot, and there will be some people who are on the team who have not been through training and maybe haven't started with Puppet at all, and I will actually shuffle them off and say, spend the morning looking through this stuff. I'm going to work with the higher level folks, the folks that have more Puppet experience, and I'm going to loop back with you at the end of the day. Great resource. The next resource I want to talk about, I would guess, based on our marketing, that most of you guys have seen this, the Learning VM. So this is a self-contained VM you can download for VMware. VirtualBox is bundled with some exercises to get you familiar with some of the core concepts of Puppet. And a lot of the exercises are geared in such a way that they have some similarity to the stuff that we would actually teach in a Puppet fundamentals class if you were to come to a 3-day training. So great thing to download, whether or not you're going to come to training. I actually tell people, if I can sort of touch them before they come to class, download this thing and play with it for a while, because then you're going to have a certain fidelity with the materials. When you get into the class, you're going to absorb way more. Also, after you're done with the 3-day class, usually it wraps on Thursday, Monday morning, if you haven't already, download this thing, go through the exercises, hammer that material in, get the you gotta get the finger memory. All that, like I said, sort of feeds into the training. You guys have probably seen this slide, and I think we may have someone talking about the training program later. We have 2 tracks, admin and developer. The fundamentals and advanced are on both tracks, and there's certifications at the end of each of those. If you're thinking about training and you've been doing Puppet for a while, you're probably thinking, meh, I'll just go right to advanced. I wouldn't do it. Every time we teach advanced, I have students who've been doing Puppet for a year or 2 who come in and they're like, wow, I thought I knew more about this than I did, and I really probably should have taken fundamentals first. So it's not necessarily the most efficient. They don't get the most out of that class that they could. So if you can shake a little bit of money from your organization to do the fundamentals, I would highly recommend doing that. Also, excellent. I wasn't aware we were going to be giving away the books, but for those who just received Pro Puppet, I was going to mention that there is a second edition. First edition was great, but it had gotten a little bit long in the tooth. A couple of new authors picked up the material, sort of collaborated with the previous authors, and this thing went live on Amazon a couple of months ago or something like that. I would say this is kind of the Bible of Puppet right now. In my opinion, I have no stake in this, but in my opinion, this is probably the best book that's out there right now. So when I tell you that I often do not send people to the mailing lists looking for help initially, here's where I actually send them. So this is Stack Exchange. I can never remember the name of the website. Stack Overflow. I always get those two confused. This is Stack Overflow specifically for Puppet. Ask.puppetlabs.com. I'm on there. It's been around for probably going on a year now. When it started out, most of the accounts were actually people who were internal to Puppet Labs. So the people that were answering questions were employees, which is kind of cool because it was like this back channel for support, right? The community has kind of latched onto this thing, and now there are probably as many or more people coming from the community answering questions. I like this over the users mailing list because it's karma-based. If you consistently answer questions well and the community sort of agrees with your answers filter up, like your reputation sort of filters up, and for somebody who's coming to the site fresh, looking for an answer to a question, gives them a little bit more information as to like the quality of the answer that's coming back at them. You don't necessarily have that assurance on the users list because like I said, it's just kind of a free-for-all. Two things, the next two actually, the blog and the Twitter page. I'm not sure who's responsible like ultimately for these two resources at Puppet Labs, but I honestly think that when it comes to the social media side, with the blog, with Twitter, and with the Puppet Labs channel on YouTube, I really think we do, I can't think of another company that does the social media thing better. There's so much good content out there. You'd be tempted to maybe subscribe to the Puppet Labs YouTube channel, but the shortcut to that, the shortcut to getting access to the blog and to the YouTube channel without getting overwhelmed with the material is just to join, or is just to follow Puppet Labs on Twitter. And most everything, but certainly the highlights from those two channels will pop up on Twitter at some point. That's a lot of internet-y stuff, but how about in the real world? There are people out in the real world. PuppetConf 2014 is announced, yes, as being in San Francisco. So that's easy for probably most everyone in the room today. Obviously, you figured out the Puppet Camp thing. These things happen, 20 or 30 times throughout the year in various places. And then there are a couple of Bay Area meetups. There are a lot of Puppet meetups around the country. Sometimes when I'm traveling and training, I'll just pop in on one just to see how they're doing. The ones in the Bay Area are kind of being spun back up for a while because the people who were leading them were so busy with other things. It's that same sort of problem. Like, let's see, other resources. I think that's a pretty good summary. So, did anybody see anything in there that they had not seen before, like specifically ask.puppetlabs.com? No? You all seen all those? Okay. I can't encourage you to go to that one enough, ask.puppetlabs.com. That one's great. Okay, so I want to talk, just kind of touch briefly on style, Puppet DSL style. I think Ryan is going to be doing a presentation later today on best practices in terms of Puppet modules, so some of that will sort of tie into what we're going to talk about here. There are some tools that, they're not that complicated, but maybe they're kind of hidden in the documentation, and when people get started with Puppet, they may not know that they're there, and missing out on them does probably impede your progress. So when I say validate your code, there is, if you look at the second half of this command, Puppet parser validate, there is a tool that's built into Puppet that you can pass it the path to some Puppet code. In that case, I just have a find command that just goes into basically the current directory and finds everything that's a .pp file and passes that through Puppet parser validate. So this is going to check for brackets and commas and real basic syntax problems. It's not going to look at like the semantics of your code. It's not going to try to go and it'll catch if you've misquote, if you like using a double quote and a single quote in the same line and you're not closing. But just a real basic syntax check. And there's also this one, the Puppet style guide. So you can install this tool called Puppet Lint, for those who are familiar with like CLint back in the day. And this will pass the code that you pass to it through a bunch of tests to see if it lines up with the style guide. It's pretty pedantic. I like to do one-liners, so like if I have a notify, I don't always put the message on the second line of the notify resource, and it'll yell at you for that. But so it does have a series of command line flags that you can pass to optionally turn on, turn off some of the more pedantic checks. Were you giving me a hard time about my style over there? Yeah. Pro tip related to this stuff. Most organizations that I work with who are versioning their module code will actually implement checks in their repositories where they're storing that code to pass the code through both of those tools. And if it doesn't pass going through both of those tools, then they just reject the commit. I say, yeah, here's the problem, go fix this, try it again. So the one-liner one is the one I usually disable when I'm on site, and then I enable it when I leave. No, I'm joking. This is sort of obscure. I find that not that many people know about this, but this is pretty cool. There is an online Puppet lint. I believe it's James Turnbull, right? James Turnbull, who used to work at Puppet Labs and was sort of a longtime Puppet community member, has a Puppet lint as a service, if you will. And I actually just was looking at it this morning and realized that you can point it at a GitHub repository, and it'll, I guess when you do commits to the repository, it'll use the post-receive hooks to run that code through Puppet lint. Very clever, very cool. One of the other things that I often see a lot of confusion about, but especially as students coming out of fundamentals, it's like it's the like meat of something they can learn that's going to like make their Puppet code. The one thing they could learn that would make their Puppet code better immediately was to grasp this concept of roles and profiles. So I'll show you an example of what I'm talking about roles and profiles in a second. I'm first aware of this sort of being publicly presented, I guess you will, by Craig Dunn, who was a professional service engineer at Puppet Labs. He may not be responsible for it, he may be the first one to publicize it, but regardless, at that link, I didn't shorten that one, but if you go to that link, and again, this will all be on Twitter later, you can actually get, it's probably a good 5 or 6 screens, talks about the roles and profile pattern. Like I said, we now teach this as part of the Puppet Labs training. Very briefly before I show you some code, it's roles are comprised of profiles, and profiles are composed of what we call component level modules. So the way that I usually explain this is, I might have a role mail server that I classify in my Puppet code, and the role mail server is a roll-up of a bunch of profiles that implement Exchange. And then there are component level modules, maybe that are coming from the Forge, that are responsible for actually doing the low level details of installing Exchange on that box that's been classified with the role. The nice thing about that is you may have somebody in your organization that's not a Puppet person, but they're able to log into the console and do classification there, and they say, well, this is a mail server by its role. And they don't care how it's implemented. By making that separation, then down the road you decide you want to move to a mail system other than Exchange. They're still classifying with role mail server, but the implementation is hidden away, and it could be a completely different implementation. So just very quickly, I won't spend too much time on it. And I actually haven't run this code, so anybody who spots a syntax error or some sort of logical error, you win a t-shirt. You win a t-shirt anyway. But so this just meant to sort of serve as a basic example of roles and profiles. We have Profile Apache, RabbitMQ Client, and Memcache, and these things get rolled up in the role app server. So somebody might classify site role app server, and they would get those profiles. So the role level is like stuff that a business person or a non-technical person might care about the most, and the profiles are things that like the techies, the people in operations, maybe even the people in development, that they really care about the most. And I actually called out in the comments there that when you get down to the component level, like RabbitMQ Client, that's probably coming from the Forge. This is an example of how you can take Forge modules and sort of glue them together, higher and higher levels of abstraction, and make them work with site-specific data in your environment. Like I said, we started teaching this in class recently. If you would like more information about this outside of what Craig has on his website and what you find on the Puppet Labs website, come grab me afterwards and we can actually go through it in a little bit more detail. I feel like, how many people here have heard of Hiera? Okay, most of it. How many people here have, let's see, so people that heard of Hiera, raise your hand. People that have heard of Hiera but don't really understand it. Okay. And then how many people had never heard of Hiera? Okay, so most people have. You could do an entire presentation on Hiera, and I feel like maybe at some point I will, although it's been done. If you go to the Puppet Labs YouTube channel, there's a couple of presentations from PuppetConf, I think this year and last year, where they talk about effective use of Hiera. I was going to put a URL in here. I forgot to do it. Gary Larizza is a professional service engineer at Puppet Labs. He's written a series of articles about effective use of Hiera. I'll add that to the slides, and then if you go down download this later, you should be able to find it. Okay, so now remember I said that this presentation could almost be retitled Vagrant and how to use Vagrant. That's where we're getting there now. But first I want to talk about Get. Anybody not familiar with Get? So software version control, right? Now we're now treating, is the whole infrastructure as code thing, we're now treating our Puppet code just as we would application code. So we're versioning it and deploying particular versions and maybe rolling back to previous versions. For better or worse, I actually like HG, I like Mercurial a lot, but Get has the traction in the community. So if you are a Puppet, if you're learning Puppet and you're not familiar with Get, probably you want to do that in parallel. If you want to function within your team, and most of the people that we run into are actually using Get. Subversion and Perforce are common too, but Get probably 80% or more. The sooner you learn Get, the better. In terms of resources for Get, there are a couple of, I'm sure everyone here is familiar with GitHub. There's Bitbucket, which is sort of an alternative to GitHub. I think they may have actually preceded them, I'm not sure. But don't forget about Bitbucket. I like Bitbucket because they have free private repos. So you can work on some Puppet code and you're just getting started and it's really ugly and you don't necessarily want it out there on the web for everyone to see, and you can at least version your code and stick it away into a Bitbucket repo until you're ready to publicize. In terms of actually learning Get, in my opinion, this Get SCM is probably if you go to that URL, the book that's linked there is probably the best book to get started. And then I just actually discovered this during a professional services gig a couple of weeks ago. Sorry, the URL's a little hairy, but this thing is a webby sort of demo of how to do Get branching, and like it'll throw you into a console and you can do the operations and it'll actually show them graphically. It'll build the directed acyclic graph and you can actually see the merges happening and things like that. So if you're a visual learner, that might be an easier way to sort of grok what's going on. As I said, we could almost just call this thing First Learn Vagrant. I almost call this presentation First Learn Vagrant. So I have a feeling that most people in here have at least heard of Vagrant, and probably a lot of you are using it. I'm going to start really basic with Vagrant, and I'm going to build up because there are some modules that we use internally at Puppet Labs for reference architectures, for experimentation, that I feel like are not well known, but they're super, super useful. So there's the website, vagrantup.com. You can get documentation and downloads and all that stuff for Vagrant there. As just a real quick flyby, what is Vagrant? Basically, disposable, reusable VMs defined in a Ruby-like language, and it ties into VirtualBox, VMware, LXC. I just saw they have Docker support now. So pretty much any sort of virtualization backend that you can think of, you can sort of write Ruby code to deploy, destroy, rebuild your nodes. You kind of like a little AWS on your box, right? Disposable nodes. So I want to show you just a couple of quick things with Vagrant. Like I said, we'll start real simple, and then we'll build up. I'm going to be doing a little bit of work over here in this Vagrant standalone directory first. So there's nothing in here at all. So if I wanted to create a Vagrant environment, like the most basic Vagrant environment I could, I run that Vagrant init command, and that actually generates, when I talk about that sort of Ruby-ish config language, there's a lot of boilerplate in there because of the documentation. Let's clean that out. So when we get rid of the documentation, that's really all it boils down to. So with the Vagrant command line, I can actually say, what's the status of this environment? And you'll actually see that it has a default node, but we haven't created it yet. So let me kick that off. We probably won't wait for it to finish because that can take a minute or two. But if I run Vagrant up, it's going to go look at the settings that were in that Vagrant file. And I'm using VirtualBox, so it's going to spin up a VM running on VirtualBox. Where's my VirtualBox? Well, it should. There we go. So this is the new, actually that's not it. Puppet agent. Sorry, I'm logged in as one user and doing the demo as another user, so we're not seeing it. But it's going out and talking to VirtualBox and creating a VM that lives in VirtualBox for this really, really basic setup. Now it doesn't actually, we can connect to it here. And now we're actually in that VM. It's not doing anything useful because it's just like the absolute most basic Vagrant configuration that we could possibly come up with. Let me get rid of that VM. And I'm going to show you something. This is where actually the rubber starts to hit the road and this thing starts to get kind of useful. So I'm just going to blow away that VM that we created before. And instead of standalone, I'm going to go into a multi-node. So there's a Vagrant file that I've already created. And the reason I have one in there already is because I actually customized it quite a bit. So this is getting a little more interesting. What we're doing here is we have, if you look there at the bottom, we've defined a node 0 and node 1. These are two VMs that Vagrant will then spin up for us. And we actually have some default settings at the top there where Vagrant has this notion of a provisioner. So it spins the node up to what I call state 0. And then it's going to hand it off to the provisioner to turn this node into something useful. And in this case, we're calling into the Puppet provisioner. So we've got some Puppet code that's going to configure these two nodes. Let me move that to the top. So manifest directory, modules directory, and then there's this curious thing called the Puppet file and this Puppet file.lock. We'll come back to that in a second. Just as if you had like a full-blown Puppet master, you had a site.pp, this environment has a site.pp that we're handing to the provisioner. And you can see if we go in there, we just have a tiniest little bit of code to configure NTP if it's not already. And the notify resource for those who are totally new to Puppet just prints something at the console, basically. So I do a Vagrant status. I see that I have the two VMs, neither one of them are created. I'm going to just spin up the first one, node 0. Or I would if I give it an up. We're actually going to let this one go, because I want you to see the output that this chucks out. VirtualBox is all warmed up, so it should only take a second to get us a VM this time. Now the Puppet run is in verbose mode. This is essentially a Puppet apply. So once VirtualBox is done spinning up the node, we're actually going to see some Puppet-like output scroll by as well. So I say that the rubber starts to hit the road with this kind of a setup for two reasons. Number one, we have access to this provisioner now, and we can make these nodes turn into something we actually care about. And number two, we can start modeling our deployment environments because we have the ability to spin up multiple nodes. I don't know too many people that are going to deploy their application on a single node. So that first example, it's good for educational purposes, I guess. But you can actually see there, from that site.pp, we configured NTP, and then we print out somewhere in here. May have scrolled by. But we printed out that message that said, hey, I'm so-and-so. As an aside, we look at the modules directory. There's our NTP module. That came from the Forge. I didn't write that. And the standard lib module is something that NTP relies on that came from the Forge also. So I want to show you guys another tool related to these little self-contained environments that you can use to model your production environments. I'm going to do something that seems a little crazy. So now I only have the manifest site.pp. So then if I try to do something like Vagrant provision, rerun the provisioner on node 0, I think I should get an error because it's going to say I can't find the code that you told me is supposed to be in my environment. Yeah. But this Puppet file thing, this is a really, really simple example of a Puppet file. Puppet file is consumed by a handful of tools, one of which is Librarian Puppet, and another one is something that one of our engineers at Puppet Labs wrote called R10K. Anybody heard of R10K? Definitely put that on your Google list. That's like total awesomeness. I don't know, I try not to remember what pro services gigs were like before we had R10K. It's so great. In any case, what we have here is Ryan's Forge. We're telling it to go to forge.puppetlabs.com to fetch modules. And then you can kind of almost think of this as like a make file. It's going in and saying, well, there should be a module on the Forge called Puppet Labs NTP, and I want version 3.0.1. So you define this Puppet file, and that's great. So I put it in the text file, but what does that get me? If I run Librarian Puppet, install, and I'm going to do verbose just so we can see what's going on. I guess it's probably cached, right? I want you to actually see it coming down from the Forge. Let's try that one more time. So it turns out that because that Puppet file is fairly simple, it doesn't have to do a whole lot to rebuild that modules directory, right? But think about your Puppet environment, where you might be using 24 Forge modules and a dozen modules that you've written yourself, and then start thinking about deployment pipelines, where we are hacking on code in the dev environment to add, or maybe we're going to switch from Apache to Nginx. So now we're including an Nginx module, and we're modifying all of the Puppet code in the dev environment that gets deployed to the dev environment to test our move from Apache to Nginx. Check that Puppet file in to some sort of environment repository, and then you can actually promote that branch from dev. I think somebody may have talked about this earlier, but you can actually promote that code in that Puppet file from dev to staging, or to QA, to staging, and then eventually on it into production. So this is kind of one of the hooks that we have that allows you to like really version the entire environment. If you think about, sometimes people will implement their site-specific Puppet code as its own site module. It's like kind of a weird special case module. And then they have several dozen Forge modules. That's pretty, when we throw Hiera into the picture, which I'm not going to have time to talk about today, but when we throw Hiera in the picture with that sort of concept of versioning our modules, then we've pretty much versioned our entire environment. There's some odd little corner cases that you run into if you're doing like exported resources and stuff like that. But for the most part, this is a way of capturing the state of what was the state of our Puppet managed environment 6 months ago. Go look at the environments repo. It's all in there. So like I said, this Puppet file is something that gets consumed. In this case, with Librarian Puppet, but R10K also consumes these as well. And R10K is kind of like Librarian Puppet on steroids, I guess you could say. It has a bunch of additional functionality, automatically building out environments and so on and so forth. All right, so that's the basics of why I think Vagrant is great. There's a call out to Librarian Puppet in R10K. But I haven't mentioned these. So the first iteration was not that big of a deal. The second iteration actually becomes sort of useful. And I'm going to show you the third iteration that we're probably going to have to wrap up. 2 tools, Vagrant PE Build, Vagrant Oscar. These are plugins to the Vagrant tool. I'll show you an environment that uses these, but let me explain to you what they do first. You install the Vagrant PE build plugin, and from the Vagrant file, you can say, give me 6 nodes, and they should have, one of them should be a master. You specify its role as master. One of them should, or the rest of them should all be agents, and I specify a Puppet Enterprise version. And as part of that process of spinning up a node that Vagrant does, it'll go out and install the Puppet Enterprise stuff for you. And you guys probably heard it's free up to 10 nodes, right? So you can build out a little reference architecture of at least 10 nodes that way. Oscar, on the other hand, instead of going in and modifying the Vagrant file directly, it sets up a series of directories and a series of generally YAML data files where you define the properties of your node in YAML rather than having to know Ruby. If you know YAML, it's good enough to get by. So let me show you what that looks like. So I have this demo PE3 R10K. This is an environment. This is a reference architecture that I wrote for customers that are wanting to learn about R10K. In the config directory, I have a series of YAML files, one of which is called boxes. This is kind of like your VMware templates or your VirtualBox templates. These are the images that we're going to cache and use in this environment. And then the one we probably care the most about, second most. This is our list of VMs that we're going to instantiate. So you can see we're not actually editing any kind of Ruby code here. You can see the roles, PE Puppet Master, PE Puppet Agent. And then there's a little bit more YAML that talks about what does this look like? Anybody have a guess as to what's going on there? Remember when we specified the Puppet provisioner in the Vagrant file before? Same thing. Now we're handing, as part of the using Oscar to roll up, to spin up our environments, we're actually handing off to the Puppet provisioner to finish everything out. So we're right up against, actually we're 3 minutes over. There's a little bit more content here if you're interested in what's, like I said, I'll post the slides later today. If you're interested in what's in the slides after this, you can feel free to reach out to me.